Hi, everyone. I'm excited to welcome you all to our HITRUST webinar, Staying Ahead of the Curve with Threat Adaptive Assessments. I'm Jessica Brown, and I will be your moderator today. On today's call, we'll cover CSF version 11 update, sunsetting legacy CSF versions, I-1 assessment updates, and then we'll cover any questions. I'd like to now introduce our presenters, Andrew Russell, VP of Standards, Ida Mwaniki, Director of IT Audit and Assurance, Samantha Lalama, Senior Analyst, Operational Initiatives, and Mike Parisi, VP of Adoption, who will be our guide as we walk through the key enhancements and updates that come with the release of the HITRUST CSF version 11. I'd like to now hand it over to Mike to get us started.
Thanks, Jess, and thanks everyone for joining us today. It's great to see old friends and some new names that are joining us for today's discussion. For the group, I would tell you what we're about to go through today is really some unprecedented things that we've done here at HITRUST. We're really excited to dive into the detail. I will tell you a little bit of it is very technical, so stay with us as we step through some of the enhancements that we've made, not only to the CSF framework, but also to the assessment portfolio. I think as Jimmy Fallon likes to say, you're here, you made it. We're very excited with this major release that we've had from the framework. It's been quite some time. And everything that we've done relative to enhancements to the programs that we're going to talk about today is really focused on addressing the feedback that we've received from the market and from the community relative to obtaining HITRUST assurances, implementing the CSF, and ultimately becoming HITRUST certified. All the changes that we've made are really focused on making this journey easier, more efficient, and more effective for organizations, while maintaining the integrity, transparency, and strength of the overall assurance programs we've had in place for quite some time. So I'm really excited to get into this. As Jessica mentioned, I'm joined by a number of my colleagues, and the first person I'd like to pass it off to talk about version 11 and what those changes incorporate from a framework perspective and how it's going to make the lives easier of our assessed entities, relying parties, and our assessor partners is Andrew Russell, our Vice President of Standards here at HITRUST. So Andrew, let's get into some of the cool and interesting things that we've done with the release of version 11 most recently as it relates to the CSF.
Thanks, Michael. I'm excited to announce that with the introduction of v11, the HITRUST portfolio will be threat adaptive and traversable. The R2 baseline will move from the level 1 requirements on the 75 controls required for certification to the I1 requirements, which themselves contain the E1 requirements as a subset. Inclusion of the I1 requirements as core on an R2 assessment allows the R2 to become threat adaptive by nature of the I1 itself being threat adaptive. HITRUST continues to monitor current cyber threat data as part of our commitment to maintain relevant control requirements within the I1 assessment to mitigate existing and emerging threats. Overlap of requirements between assessments allows organizations to use the E1 and the I1 as stepping stones to a more robust assessment, where going from the E1 to the I1 to the R2 prevents compliance efforts and efficiencies. Upon the release of the E1 assessment, the BC assessment has been removed from MyCSF and the HITRUST Assessment Exchange. Using MyCSF, assessed entities may perform the E1 readiness assessment as a self-assessment or using an external assessor. Within the HITRUST Assessment Exchange, the BC assessment is now called the E1 self-assessment. On the next slide, we'll talk about the v11 content changes.
And Andrew, maybe before we move to the next slide, so a lot to unpack there. I think one of the most exciting things that you just stepped through is the threat adaptive nature, right? As we know, and I think as our community knows, that only existed within the I1 assessment or the I1 certification in prior years. And about a year ago, that's when we started to incorporate that within the framework. And we've had a number of organizations ask us, well, why isn't the R2 threat adaptive? And how do we ensure the overall portfolio becomes threat adaptive over a period of time? So what's really exciting, as you indicated, is now the entire portfolio has become cyber threat adaptive. So organizations know the controls within the scope of whatever assessment they may do are addressing the most common cyber threats and risks. That's pretty exciting to me. I think the nesting of the portfolio also that you indicated, all the requirements that exist within our new E1 certification that I know there's going to be some additional material about that, educating the community, but all of those become the basis of the I1. The I1 becomes the basis of the R2. So I know when we first launched the I1, that was not the case. However, with all the work that you and your team have done, we now have a fully nested portfolio, allowing organizations to start their journey and move along the assurance continuum over a period of time. So that's pretty exciting. Thanks for that detail. And we can probably go to the next slide, as you indicated.
Yes, thank you, Mike. So in a current V9 assessment, the evaluative elements are contained in the policy illustrative procedure. As you can see in the example on this slide, there are instances where the ask isn't easy to decipher, as the evaluative elements are part of a large body of text that needs to be parsed out manually. On the next slide, you'll see that to solve this, we've migrated the evaluative elements from the policy IP to the requirement statement and enumerated and formatted the evaluative elements for readability. This leads to an easier to parse requirement with greater transparency on scoring. So on the next slide, you'll see that as part of the same effort, we've updated all of the illustrative procedures for clarity. The policy procedure and managed IP will use standard and concise wording. The implemented and measured IP will still contain requirement-specific content, but with new formatting to make identification of that content easier. On the next slide, we're going to talk about the new authoritative source mappings, such as the highly anticipated NIST 853 Revision 5 and the Health Industry Cybersecurity Practices. We've also refreshed existing mappings for HIPAA, NIST CSF, and NIST 800-171. Now, this will be our first mapping release powered by natural language processing technology, where AI is used to perform an initial mapping of the authoritative source to the HITRUST CSF. Each mapping then goes through at least 3 levels of human review, with most going through 4. As part of the review process, my team is using the NIST OLER methodology to define mapping relationship type and strength, with the goal of improving the quality and effectiveness of the authoritative source mappings that we release.
And Andrew, this is, again, some great work that's been done by your team. If we focus on the evaluative elements component, and I'm sure many of our audience members are very happy with this change. Those that aren't familiar with how the framework was really structured in the past is looking at the framework at the control level, right, Andrew, is not really the most accurate way to determine how to effectively implement the framework and then also assess against it. You really need to get down to what we're referring to as this evaluative element level. The problem that has existed in the past, as you mentioned, is all of those detailed requirements in order to satisfy the control has really existed within one big block of text, right, within the IP. So it became difficult for organizations to understand what are all the things that they have to actually do to implement and assess against in order to achieve those controls. And in many instances, if you didn't read that in significant detail, you may have missed some of those requirements. So what the community has been asking us for years is there any way you can make that easier Can you make it easier for us to digest, understand exactly what we need to do? Can you make it easier for our assessor partners to understand what they need to evaluate? So by taking all those elements from that long paragraph with all the details that an organization needs to do and putting those directly within the requirement statement, it's really in support of one of our key pillars around transparency. It becomes more transparent in terms of what organizations need to do to appropriately implement the framework and what those elements are that the assessor partners, in the event of validated assurances, need to assess in order to perform those activities on the testing side. So to me, that's huge, right? It makes it easier, as we've been talking about, for organizations to truly understand what they need to do from an element perspective. And it's also, I know, allowed your team to really speed up and make the process of mapping new authoritative sources, as you mentioned, more efficient and more effective. You know, I think another important thing that you mentioned, the community's been asking us to ensure incorporation of NIST 853 Rep 5s. That is huge. That's going to be very important as we continue conversations with other organizations around the potential for reciprocity and acceptance of HITRUST certification. So you're going to hear more about that in the upcoming months. But whether it's federal or state agencies that we're working very closely with that are aligned to NIST 853 Rep 5, that has really enabled us to speed up those conversations and put additional programs in place. Andrew, the last thing I wanted to mention on was this concept of refreshed. And I know a lot of the conversations that you and I have had in the market, sometimes we get a question around, well, what does refresh mean, right? And I know we've got an indication on the slide, but maybe just to provide a little more clarity around what we mean when we talk about a refresh. And Andrew, feel free to jump in here, but there's really two triggers that will result in a refresh within the framework. One would be a change in the underlying authoritative source requirements in and of itself, right? So for example, if NIST 800-171 is updated, I think as our community knows, we ensure that the CSF is updated to reflect the changes in the underlying authoritative sources. So that could trigger a quote-unquote refresh. But I think the other important thing that you mentioned, Andrew, something that we have not had in place in the past, and thanks to you and your team and the investments that you've made, is really to fine-tune and enhance the mappings that we have in place relative to the authoritative sources. So in the past, if we were kind of throwing the kitchen sink at a particular authoritative source to say, there's 20 different controls within the framework that may map to this requirement within HIPAA, it became somewhat bloated. And in that instance, a lot of organizations looked at that and said, well, maybe I don't have to do all 20 to ensure I meet that requirement from a HIPAA perspective. So part of the refresh I know that you and your team have done and that we'll continue to do is to really look at that mapping that currently exists and figure out how can we potentially reduce the number of requirements that are mapped to a particular authoritative source without sacrificing the appropriate coverage for an organization to ensure compliance with that standard. Anything to add there, Andrew? I mean, that's pretty exciting with the investments that your team has made.
No, thank you for adding all of that different color. It's also worth considering when we go back and do these refreshes, we also have to consider changes to the HITRUST framework itself, where some of the requirements might have shifted over time due to either changes in the elements or changes in the rigor of the requirement. And it's always good to go back and reevaluate those previous mappings to see if we still agree, especially if we can apply this new AI mapping solution or the OLER methodology to that previous mapping, and it really justifies and strengthens those mappings.
Yeah, that's another great point, because You know, a lot of organizations within the community are interested in the quality and confidence of our mappings, right? I know you get these questions, and I get them all the time, as do my colleagues. Well, how do we know that the mappings that you have done have followed some type of methodology, right? This isn't just opinion-based, and I think that the NIST online informative references, as you mentioned, that is a tried and true methodology, and it's something that we continue to enhance as we do those mappings. So lastly, Andrew, as I see one of the questions that has come in, and this is a big one that we get, but we'll address it quickly, is this concept of duplication, or as we like to say, deduping the framework, right? I know one of the pain points that a lot of organizations have had throughout the years is they may see the same requirement appear under multiple different domains or areas of the CSF, and they find themselves in really an inefficient manner having to copy and paste or point to the same requirement multiple times, even though it was documented once already or assessed once already. With the evaluative elements being included within the requirement statement, that now sets the stage and gives us the capability with future releases to really start deduping those requirements across different areas of the framework that we did not have the ability to do before, since the IP elements were not included within the requirement statements themselves. So pretty excited about that, and I know you're really excited, Andrew, for you and your team to get started on that initiative and future releases.
Absolutely, we are. So thank you for bringing that up.
Great. Okay, I think we can keep going.
All right. So as far as V11 and inheritance, external inheritance can be used between V11 assessments and V9 assessments. However, due to the change in the R2 baseline mentioned previously, there may be requirement statements present in the baseline V9 assessments that are not present in the baseline V11 assessments, and vice versa. To support compatibility between V11 and V9 assessments, we've created a legacy inheritance support factor, which can be used to include additional inheritable V9 baseline requirement statements into V11 R2 assessments. With that,
yeah, and that's really important, Andrew. Let's just give a little commentary on that before we move to IDA. You
Sure.
know, one of the biggest things that I know you focused on as we were building version 11 and coming up to the release of version 11 was to make sure we didn't, quote unquote, break inheritance, right? We know how important inheritance is to our community, and how it really enables organizations to achieve the implementation of the CSF and ultimately HITRUST validated assurances or certification more seamlessly, relying upon their business partners, their third parties and vendors, especially within the cloud service space, is critical to many, if not all of our customers. So I think having that inheritance support function in place should really reassure the community that inheritance is not broken. You'll continue to leverage inheritance, even if your cloud service provider or your vendor continues to be on a V9.x assessment. Over time, right, I think the entire community will move toward version 11, but we've got a mechanism in place to ensure you'll be able to leverage inheritance. And further, one of the things, Andrew, I know that's available that organizations can really dig further into those details is that the cross-version ID, right? That's something that exists within the framework as well. So if you're wondering, hey, I did all this work around this requirement under 9.6, what does that equate to in version 11? The inclusion of the cross-version ID within the CSF and within my CSF will allow you to get that visibility pretty quickly and effectively. So we won't have a lot of time to dig into that in significant detail on today's webinar, but I do encourage you to reach out to your CSMs, your customer success managers, to learn more about that as you look at and prepare for perhaps readiness-related activities associated with version 11. So thanks, Andrew. Great update. Really excited about what's coming. So Ida, you know, next in line, as we talk about all the new things that are going to be coming, the next question we usually get is, what happens with the old stuff? So I know you've built a great timeline relative to what those legacy versions of the CSF will look like, how long they're going to be around. And we've taken a very liberal approach from a runway perspective to ensure that organizations have a lot of time before they'll be in a position where they need to move to version 11. So let me hand it to you to talk about the timeline, and I think everyone's going to be pretty happy with how long they're going to have in order to make that transition.
Thank you, Mike. And I agree with you. We've taken the difference within the timeline will give the community enough time to prepare for the transition. We'll be sunsetting several legacy CSF versions. Within the R2 validated assessment, it will be CSF versions 9.1 through 9.4 will be transitioning to an end-of-life process. Version 9.5 and 9.6 will continue to be available for the R2 assessments. With the timeline, it will start this year, September 30th, 2023, the ability to create a new assessment object with the CSF version 9.1 through 9.4 will be disabled, and any object created after September 30th, 2023 must be version 9.5 or later. And then 15 months after that, the ability to submit the created assessment objects with CSF versions 9.1 through 9.4 will be disabled. I would also like to point out the reservation system will also be disabled. You won't have the ability to reserve a slot to submit an assessment created with version 9.1 through 9.4 after December 31st, 2024. Then 15 months later, that's March 31st, 2026, all the libraries for CSF version 9.1 through 9.4 will be removed from my CSF. A few key points to note here. All through the transition time towards end of life, we'll be providing support as long as the libraries are available in my CSF, but as of after March 31st, 2026, the libraries will be removed. Another key point to take away, the items that will not be impacted. The interims and bridge assessments will continue to be utilizing the same versions the main assessment was created in, because it's still within that timeline of 12 to 24 months. Also, internal and external inheritance will continue to be available from version 9.1 through 9.5 within the active period of the assessments. So those two items will not change. Then
that's really helpful. Sorry, let me just jump in there for a second. So the way I like to talk about this is, as we've socialized it with some customers already, you and I both, is this is not a significant emotional event, right? I mean, just looking at the timeline, I know a lot of organizations are still on 9.4, on 9.3. There's a handful that might still be on 9.1, but if you're looking at the timeline, you effectively have almost 9 months to create an object, right? That September date is the date that you need to have your object created. That does not mean that your assessment on that version needs to be completed. You have almost 2 years to complete an assessment on, say, 9.3 or 9.4, if that's where you are from a business perspective. So, I think staying in line with the theme that we've been talking about, Ida, making the HITRUST journey and efforts easier for organizations and more seamless to not only adopt, but also move along the maturity scale. This fits right in line with that goal, making sure organizations have plenty of time to evaluate the new version, but also continue to produce assessments for their customers and stakeholders on some of those legacy versions for quite some time.
I agree. And the last slide, not the next one. After I cover I1, we'll also outline for you some of the functions we have in my CSF to help the customers prepare for that. The next one will be with the I1. This one won't have a long runaway. We'll be changing this within this year. But you'll also hear from some of the updates with the I1, which the change will allow the community to take advantage of the development and updates of I1 within version 11. But for any I1s created with version 9.6.2 and older, effective April 30th, you won't have the ability to create those assessment objects. It will be disabled. Also, the reservation system has also been disabled. As of July 31st, 2023, you won't have the ability to submit those assessment objects to HITRUST. So you'll be required after April 30th to create assessment objects for the I1 assessment with the new version 11. Then with the sunsetting of the legacy CSF versions, we have functionalities within my CSF that I'll outline in the next slide that will help you prepare with any readiness activities you'll have. Within my CSF, we do have the preview functionality where you can download a comparison report that will outline the key changes in the libraries and also the assessment, the requirement statements. It gives you the detail of what will change. So we would encourage you to utilize these functions in your readiness activities and also to give you a clear preview of what will change during this transition period. Now I'll turn it to Sam to walk through some of the updates with the I1 that will give you a better picture why the runaway is much shorter for the I1 versus the R2 to transition.
Yeah, thanks, Ida. Maybe Sam, before we jump in, one of the questions I think, Ida, some folks might be thinking about what you just talked about with the I1 is, wow, why are we disabling 9.6 for I1 so quickly? Isn't I1 a new certification? That's a new assessment that was just released last year, and there's a very good reason why we're encouraging organizations to move toward the version 11 instance of the I1 if you are currently I1 certified or performed an I1 assessment, or even if you started readiness activities from an I1 standpoint, because we know there's a lot of organizations that will be in that boat. But it's pretty exciting in terms of the updates we've made to the I1, and it will make sense as to why we're encouraging that timeline to be reduced to move to version 11 in the spirit of making it easier, more efficient, and more effective. So, Sam, before we go to you, I just want to provide a little commentary around the I1. I think as most organizations know, for a number of years, we were somewhat of a one-trick pony. We only had one certification, which was the HITRUST certification. In our community of stakeholders, relying parties, assessed entities, and assessors, been asking us for years to say, we understand you've got the gold standard and the highest bar relative to security and privacy assurances. However, when you look across the market and the community, that does not necessarily fit every risk profile from an organizational perspective. Has HITRUST ever considered coming up with something like, quote unquote, HITRUST Light, or can you come up with an an assurance mechanism that better aligns to the inherent risk that a particular organization introduces into the marketplace. And for a number of years, we have looked at that. We were trying to figure out how do you build something and expand the assessment portfolio so that it does better align to the inherent risk associated with those organizations, but at the same time, it doesn't break the foundational elements of what HITRUST is, right? The high level of transparency, the accuracy associated with the framework and the way that the assessment process is performed. So the I-1 was our first go at that, if you will, about a year ago. I think based upon the feedback we got from the community, we got a lot of things right, and there were some things that needed to be adjusted. So tremendous feedback from our community members, and a big thank you to everyone that provided us that feedback over the last several months around the I-1 more specifically. And we're excited to talk about the changes that we have made, not only relative to the controls that are included within the I-1, but the process itself to make it more efficient and more effective, and to address the feedback from the community that has really helped us to make this easier for organizations to achieve. So with that, Sam, let me hand it to you to talk about some of the exciting updates that we've made with the I-1 that will be available with version 11.
Great, thank you. And let's get into the first topic here is what will the V11 I-1 assessment look like in terms of number of requirements? So the V11 I-1 assessment will contain 182 requirement statements. And as you may know, the I-1 assessment on version 9.6.2 includes 219 requirement statements. So we have seen a decrease in the total number of I-1 requirements going from version 9.6.2 to version 11. You may be wondering why there's a lower number of requirements in version 11, and it's really due to all of the work that was done by the standards team in their authoritative source mappings and in their threat intelligence work and analysis of the threats that are out there in the wild. So the two main factors that have contributed to this decrease, like I said first, is the refresh of the authoritative sources. So there are some authoritative sources that impact the requirement statements on the I-1 assessment. For example, the NIST 800-171 that was refreshed in V11. Doing those refreshes and really kind of dialing in on what requirement statements really map to that source, we were able to reduce the number of requirements in the I-1. And second is the evolution of our threat intelligence work, making sure that we have a threat adaptive requirement set for the I-1. We have seen in the last year that the I-1 really does provide a very high level of coverage for the mitigation of threats as we've done our analysis. And with V11, we were able to consolidate, reduce the number of requirement statements while still maintaining that high level of threat coverage in the 182 requirement statements that are included in the V11 I-1 assessment. And as a reminder from kind of what Andrew had presented earlier, let's look at this diagram that we showed and focus specifically on the I-1 assessment. So remember, the I-1 assessment here is falling in the middle between the E1 and the R2. And so this selection of 182 requirements for the I-1 is inclusive of the requirements in the E1, and then those requirements are used in the R2 baseline as well. So you can see where that selection of requirements fits into the whole assessment portfolio here with version 11.
And Sam, I think, you know, you've already started to put the teaser out there in the last slide that aligns to my commentary earlier around why are we encouraging organizations to move toward version 11 for the I-1 specifically. It's going to be less controls, right? And as the community really provided us feedback over the last year or so, the original 219 controls that were in place still felt a little heavy-handed, especially for some of those smaller organizations or those that were trying to get started. And I think as we went back through and really refined the threat adaptive nature of the I-1 portfolio of controls, and also tying it back to the work that Andrew's team has done from a standards perspective to really refine those mappings. We did discover that the I-1 control set was somewhat a little bloated, if you will. So to your point, all the efforts that the team has done to get that set of control requirements down and more refined relative to good cybersecurity program posture has really allowed us to make it easier for organizations to adopt and execute against, but only available within version 11 from an I-1 perspective. The other thing, we talked about this a little earlier on in the webinar, but I want to reinforce it and maybe provide a little commentary specific to the I-1 when we talk about this concept of nesting. One of the key feedback points that we had for organizations, Sam, as you know, that we're looking to do an I-1 versus an R2, when they were evaluating those, there were a couple things that jumped out. One, this perception that, well, in some instances, it looks like the I-1 over a 2-year period could be just as much work, if not more, than an R2, right? And I know you've got some slides, and we're going to dig into that a little further to address how that is not the case, especially with the changes that we've made, not only with the control set from an I-1 perspective, but as part of the process with the introduction of the rapid recertification that I know you're going to go into. But one of the things that was true is because the I-1 was the only assessment that was threat adaptive, there was a set of requirements that existed within the I-1 only that did not exist within the R2 to address that threat adaptiveness. So as a result, organizations were looking at the I-1 and saying, wow, there's 40 or 50 or 60 controls that I need to do in order to achieve an I-1 certification, that if I go to an R2, those don't exist, right? So am I doing more work than is necessary because I can't leverage the work that I've done from an I-1 into an R2? And with the nesting of the portfolio, although that did exist last year under the old I-1, with the release of version 11, with the release of the E1 and the alignment of the portfolio, that has been eliminated. So again, allowing organizations to recognize more efficiencies in leveraging the work that they've done as they move along the assurance continuum.
Absolutely. And moving on to this next topic is exactly what you just teased here as the I-1 rapid recertification. And this really is response to kind of comments that we've received on the level of effort of the I-1 assessment. So what we're doing with version 11 is introducing this I-1 rapid recertification assessment that's meant to provide an accelerated way for an assessed entity to get their next I-1 certification, as long as they can demonstrate that the control environment has not materially degraded since the previous I-1 assessment was performed. Now, we'll get into the details of exactly how this works and how control degradation is monitored for and what you can do in the I-1 rapid recertification. But a couple of highlights here are that the rapid recertification assessment, even though it is a lower level of effort and fewer requirement statements, it does result in the same full assessment reports as a regular I-1 assessment. And it's something that can be used every other year between full I-1 assessments, assuming certain criteria is met that we'll discuss here on the next slide. So who can use the I-1 rapid recertification? When can it be used? I just said it could be used every other year, assuming these criteria are met. So the assessed entity must currently hold an I-1 certification resulting from the performance of a full I-1 assessment using CSF version 11 or later. So if you want to take advantage of this rapid recertification, you do have to first perform a full I-1 assessment using CSF version 11. The assessed entity must also intend to assess the same scope that was assessed in that previous assessment. There have to have been no significant changes in the environment that may impact their ability to meet the I-1 certification criteria. The control environment has not materially degraded since the previous I-1 assessment. And again, we'll talk a lot more about that in the coming slides. And then they have to have an assessment object available in MyCSF. So assuming all of these are true, this rapid recertification can be used every other year between full I-1 assessments. And next, we'll cover the requirement statements that are included in the rapid recertification assessment. So this rapid recertification will consist of all the I-1 requirement statements that would be included in a normal full I-1 assessment that uses the same CSF version. However, what makes this different is that in the rapid recertification, some of those requirement statements are not required to be evaluated and may instead have their scores rolled forward from the previously completed I-1 assessment. So to understand which requirement statements are required to be assessed in the rapid recertification and which are not, let's first consider the previously completed I-1 assessment. So this gray circle here represents the requirement statements included in that previous I-1 assessment. If you imagine someone starting this process this year, that would be using version 11. So this circle would be all of the I-1 requirements in version 11. Then next, moving forward, the black circle would represent the I-1 requirement statements included in the rapid recertification. So this would be the next year, and the rapid recertification will use the current CSF version at the time of its creation, which will likely be different from the version used in the previous assessment. So in our example, the previous assessment would be version 11. The next I-1 rapid recertification, depending on how many versions have been released, is maybe on 11.2. These circles don't fully overlap, as you can see, and that's due to the possibility for requirement statements to be removed or added to the I-1 assessment as a result of that quarterly threat analysis. So the kind of sliver you see on the left might be requirement statements that dropped out, and on the right are requirement statements that were added due to that threat analysis. Now, on top of this diagram, we'll start overlaying which requirement statements must be assessed during the rapid recertification. So that first set are the requirement statements that were added to the I-1 requirement selection since the previous assessment was performed. These would be those new requirements added as a result of the threat analysis. Next, the second set of requirement statements that must be assessed is a sample of 60 requirement statements that were scored in the previous I-1 assessment. This sample is very important. So this is where MyCSF will monitor and detect whether there's been material control degradation since the previous assessment. We'll discuss that in more detail once we get through this diagram. But moving on to the third set of requirements that must be assessed are those that were marked as not applicable during the previous I-1 assessment. And so what we need you to do here is just review that not applicable rationale to make sure it's still appropriate and still works for the organization. And then the final set of requirements that must be assessed includes those that required a corrective action plan in the previous I-1 assessment. Then, as long as material control degradation has not been detected in that sample of 60 requirement statements, the remaining requirement statements are not required to be reassessed and will have their scores rolled forward from the previous I-1 assessment.
So Sam, lots to unpack there, but really, really exciting. And for me, this diagram is really helpful. I know, so we've talked about this internally over the last several months. It was even difficult for us, right, to try and articulate what are all the different elements that organizations need to consider. But at the end of the day, as one of my colleagues says, bluff bottom line up front, this is reducing the level of effort in order to maintain I-1 certification over a 2-year period. And a couple things that you said, I think they're really important that you have reflected in terms of those really gray circle outlines is, although more than likely some controls may be added because of that threat adaptiveness component that you mentioned, some may fall out as well, right? Part of that threat adaptive analysis is to understand, well, what controls maybe are no longer relevant and what are the new controls. So the net level of effort, even with the addition of controls, but also with the reduction of controls, is still lower than what it was in the way that the I-1 was previously structured because of the option of a rapid recertification that is available. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to qualify for it. As you indicated, there are some things that we need to look at, such as degradation in the control environment, but that makes it pretty exciting, and I think it helps really support when we get into the two-year analysis a little further on, how the level of effort of maintaining an I-1 is certainly lower than an R2. One more comment, Sam, you're probably thinking this is, a lot of folks are saying, is this the same thing as an interim assessment on the R2? And we know it is not, right? It operates very differently. An interim assessment is much smaller from an R2 perspective, and you are not getting that full newly issued certification or report on year 2 as you were getting with the I-1 rapid recertification. So thanks for stepping us through that. I'll give it back to you to continue the material.
Awesome. Thanks for emphasizing those points. And just to add on a little bit more about the difference between the interim and the rapid recertification is that point of receiving the full report. And so just to clarify that here, these scores that are being rolled forward from the previous assessment will be included in that full assessment report. So you do receive a report showing scoring for all I-1 requirement statements. On the next slide, let's get into the details of this control degradation that I've been mentioning. So while that sample of 60 requirement statements are being assessed, MyCSF is going to be comparing those scores to the previously completed I-1 assessment. While that's happening, if 2 or fewer scores have been lowered, the assessed entity may carry over those scores from the previous I-1 assessment, roll them forward, and continue on with this rapid recertification. So that is an allowance of 2 or fewer scores being lowered in that sample of 60. However, if 3 or more scores are lowered, the assessed entity will be presented with the option to either assess an additional sample, so that would be expanding the sample to another 60 controls, or they may have to complete a full I-1 assessment and they would no longer qualify for the rapid recertification. This next slide here explains or shows all of the kind of paths, and I'll explain each one of these paths. So let's start on the left side. So first you do assess that sample of 60 requirement statements. The top option with 2 or fewer instances of degradation, as 2 or fewer scores lowered during the answering of the assessment, rapid recertification can be submitted to HITRUST with those remaining scores rolled forward. Next possibility is that there are 3 or 4 scores that have been lowered. And in that case, the assessed entity has the option. They can choose which one they want to do. They can either expand to assess an additional 60 requirement statements and see if they can move forward from there, or they can move straight to the full I-1 assessment. If they do choose the option to expand the sample, they're then allowed a total of 5 instances of degradation across the 120 requirements that they would have reviewed at that point. As long as there are 5 or fewer, they can then roll forward the remaining scores and submit that rapid recertification. However, if there are 6 or more instances of degradation, they would have to convert to a full I-1 assessment. And then that last path at the bottom, if in your initial sample of 60, there are 5 or more scores lowered, 5 or more instances of degradation, the full I-1 assessment must be completed at that point. One note that I will make, all of these options that go to the full I-1 assessment, you will have the ability in MyCSF to convert your rapid research into the full assessment, and in that conversion process, you wouldn't lose the work that's already been done. So if you've already reviewed 60 or if you've already reviewed 120 when you've gotten to that point, you can just carry those into a full I-1 assessment.
Yeah, Sam, that's really helpful. I think the way that I've been talking to customers in the community about this is you should assume that you'll qualify for the rapid recert, right? So when you start that year 2 activity, go into it in executing the procedures that you need to execute associated with the rapid recert and determine at that point if there is degradation that may throw you off that path to go for the full I-1 assessments. But multiple different options as you've outlined here. Even if there is a level of degradation, if you need to do 120 controls versus the full complement, it's still a lower level of effort than doing the full assessment in year 2. So thanks for stepping us through that.
Right. And with that, I'm going to turn to Ida to talk about one last piece of the control degradation, which is what happens during the QA process after you submit a rapid recertification.
Thank you, Sam and Mike. We wanted to also highlight that the review for control degradation does not stop, or it continues after you submit the assessment to HITRUST. So during our QA process, we do provide feedback, and sometimes that feedback leads to lowering of scores of what has been submitted. If that happens, there is a possibility the threshold that Sam walked through may be surpassed, and you may be required to expand your sample or convert that assessment to a full I-1 assessment. We want to note there is a difference of what would read you to convert the assessment to a full I-1 assessment. And there is another reason that would allow for you to remain with the I-1 rapid recertification, even if scores were lowered. So the only time we will lower scores and it impacts your threshold if those scores are lowered due to an issue with the operation of the control, that will impact the threshold of control degradation. If we request you lower the score due to an error in the testing approach or the testing documentation provided, that won't impact the threshold. I just want to make that clear. Then the control degradation during the QA process will be added to the pre-QA review. And if there are a total of 3 to 4 instances, you may be required to expand the sample by 60 requirement statements. If the total of the instances is 5 or more, you will be required to convert that assessment to a full I-1 assessment. Therefore, it will be crucial to ensure your readiness activities, your reviews are almost as accurate so that we don't come back in QA and you have to reconvert it to a full I-1 assessment. We just wanted to highlight that. And then the last slide, we just wanted to provide a visual of a 2-year count of the requirement statements that you may assess or review within a 2-year period. We've used historic data for the R2s. I believe this has been updated since the last session. And as you can see, our historic data has given us an average of, for the R2, depending with the scoped environment, you will assess approximately 375 requirement statements. And for your interim, if you count in the caps and any updated requirement statement, we average that to about 39 for a total of about 404 requirement statements. Well, if you performed an I-1 with version 11 and then you qualified for a rapid research, that's just approximately 242 requirement statements over a 2-year period. So this is a good visual to show you the level of effort and the expectation, depending with what assessment you choose from our HITRUST portfolio. And at this time, I'll turn it to Mike to close us out, and we can go to the question session.
Yeah, Ida, thank you. I think this is a great way to end the webinar, and this is a great visual for organizations to see what that level of effort is and how it aligns to the expanded assessment portfolio that we have in place, and really fixing some of those issues that did exist around that 2-year period that I know a number of our assessor partners and assessed entities were struggling with the original release of the I-1. So Ida, Andrew, Samantha, thank you. This has been great. I'm really excited about all the work that you've done and the teams here at HITRUST have done to really listen to the market and address the feedback that we've received over the last several years, and to make the ability to adopt, really leverage and assess against the HITRUST CSF more efficient for organizations and easier as we really work together and collaborate more closely on your collective journeys to improving your information security programs and providing reliable, transparent assurances to your stakeholders. So thank you all. And I think at this point in time, Jess, I know we addressed some questions as they came in. Let's see what other ones are out there.
Yeah, we just have a minute or two to address a couple more additional questions. I just want to remind everyone that they can submit written questions using the Q&A panel at the bottom right of their screen. Please type your questions in the text field and hit send. Keep the drop down as all panelists. Mike, if you want to ask a question or two while we have a minute here.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Jess. So I know we've responded to a bunch that have come in. Any of those that we don't have a chance to address, we will follow up with responses to those questions. So thanks for all the great questions that have come in. One that I want to hit right away is, how do we plan announcing changes to the core requirement selection going forward? So Andrew, Russell, I think I'll probably throw that one to you. Want to provide some insight on that for the group?
Yeah, sure. Each time that a change to the core requirement selection is made, a new major or minor CSF version will be released, and a corresponding assurance advisory will be published.
Okay, great, thanks. Samantha, next one for you around the I-1 rapid recertification. For the I-1 rapid recertification, are the rolled forward scores used in the certification and corrective action plan calculations?
Yes, they are. So the scores that have been rolled forward from the previous I-1 assessment are used to calculate the average domain scores and the average control reference scores that indicate whether certification is achieved and whether there are any corrective action plans.
Okay, great. Sam, we're going to stick with you. Lots of questions and excitement around the rapid recert. Next one, if I'm in the middle of an I-1 now, so assuming a 9.x, a 9.6 I-1, am I able to stop it and migrate to version 11?
Yes, if you are in the middle of scoring an I-1 assessment now, you haven't submitted it to HITRUST yet, you can upgrade that same assessment object to version 11. You can do that on the assessment options page in MyCSF.
Great. One more for you, Sam. How long is the assessor fieldwork period for the I-1 rapid recert?
That's a really great question. The total fieldwork period is a maximum of 90 days. With hearing that, you may be wondering what happens if you have to expand your sample. Do you get more days? You do not if you have to expand the sample. It is a total of 90 days. So we would ask the assessors to start their testing early in that 90-day period so that in the event you do have to expand to another 60 requirements, you still have time left in your 90-day fieldwork period to do so.
Great, thanks. Andrew, last one for you. Does V11 change the way that factors work from a tailoring perspective for an R2 assessment?
No, fundamentally, I mean, the baseline has changed, right? But the way that the factors work and the requirements it does bring in hasn't changed.
Okay, great. Jess, I think we're at time.
Great. This brings us to the conclusion of our webinar. I just wanted to quickly plug, we have a E1 webinar, a deep dive into the new E1 assessment on Thursday. So I did put the registration link in the chat. If anyone wants to attend that, they can go ahead and register. I'll close this out now. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you guys all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. That does conclude today's webinar. You may now disconnect your lines.